Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's Facility Show Connect Strat Talk webinar, where we'll be discussing digital FM. Thank you to FSI for sponsoring today's discussion, which is broadcast by Facility Show, part of Informa Markets. I'm Chris Edwards, Group Director at Informa Markets, and I'll be introducing and moderating today's discussion. Just a few things to note before we get started. This webinar is designed to be interactive, so please do ask any questions you have and would like answered by the panelists using the Q&A box at the top right of your screen. We've got several items for discussion already on the agenda for the early stages, but if you've got something to add, an opinion or a question, please submit away. Questions won't be made public, but will be fed through to me separately. So don't be alarmed if you can't see any questions you're submitting coming through on the platform itself. I will see them. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please type any issues into the chat box. And one of the technical team will be on hand to support you. If you'd like to watch the webinar back, or if you have any internet issues during the session, don't worry, this will be available to watch back on demand throughout June and July. It is being recorded, so feel free to log back on any time in June or July, or catch up in between meetings on the platform itself to watch at your leisure. I'm delighted to be joined by today's panel, each of whom can provide their own unique thoughts and expert insights into digital FM. You can find out more about their roles in the bios if you scroll down on the left of your screen, but I'll just allow them to introduce themselves and then we'll get going. Mike, if I can come to you first.
Sure thing. Hi everyone, Mike Greenman from Vanti. We are a master systems integrator, so that means we take different people's hardware and software, we make it work together for the benefit of people in buildings. Primary interaction with FM teams is once we come off the back of a kind of rebirth construction or fit out project, we're then working alongside those teams from a kind of operational perspective, keeping everything working, making sure it's working at its best and optimizing it over the longer term. And really excited to provide a view from people who are working in the space, seeing lots of demand for more technology to support people as they're changing their workplaces.
Thanks, Mike. And hi, Paul.
Hi there, I'm Paul Bullard. I'm Business Strategy Director for FSI. We're the global provider of IWMS or CAFM, CAFM, computer-aided facilities management solutions. I've been in this industry for nearly 25 years, and that involves rolling out some of the largest CAFM IWMS projects around the world. We have lots of customers in the UK and abroad, and we provide the solutions to help businesses be able to run their facilities.
Thanks, Paul. And Alan, can I get a few words on your background?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. I'm a professional engineer, so a malcontent by trade, but I'm also the CEO of CADM. And we're a company that makes a web-based workspace management software. So we help companies around the world with issues managing their workspace, occupancy, vacancies, moves, adds, changes, and strategic space management.
Thanks, Alan. So we sit here today with an audience who are either already dealing with the workforce that's come back after a long hiatus, or about to with the potential return if step 4 does go ahead and we come completely out of lockdown. But prior to COVID, obviously, we were seeing tech play a bigger part in the world of FM. I just wondered if I can come to the panel and just sort of ask what trends were you seeing before the pandemic? Alan, if we stay with you for a second.
Yes, certainly. I think what people have noticed over the last sort of few years is that fewer people are doing what they did back in the 80s. They don't sit down at desks all day anymore. And in fact, it used to be the case you come in and sit at a cubicle and you punch numbers into a computer all day. A lot of people did that. Now I think a lot of the computers are smart enough not to need the people, which is one development that we've certainly worked with. But people that ran office space noticed they were spending an awful lot of money on space that nobody was in. So over the years sort of coming up to the pandemic, a lot of the work that we were doing was helping people ascertain how often people were coming in, what they were doing when they got there. Because you can certainly sort of ascertain that about a third of the space was being used by people sitting down traditionally at desks. But a lot of people don't come to the office. And before the pandemic, there was about a third of people assigned desks just didn't come into the office a day. And what we got into just before the pandemic was thinking a lot with workspace companies, what were the other third doing? the people that were in the office and weren't sitting down. So this really sort of, it kind of starts to sort of drive different types of space. So collaboration space, focus space, social space, all these other kinds of things which sort of make the office a destination rather than just somewhere that you come in and sit down. So I think that's something which it'll be interesting to see how that pans out as people go back into work. But it's certainly one of the major trends that we found ourselves working with before the pandemic started last year.
Thanks, Alan. And Paul, you mentioned some pretty significant projects that you've been involved in at FSI. What if you can think back to, 2019, what were you seeing?
I think we'd absolutely seen the beginning of the whole well-being focus for offices, and people not looking so much at the whole efficiency piece, as Alan just said. It was more about people being able to get the best out of your staff, and by bringing them into your office, facilities management turned from just fixing things and making sure everything was working into recruitment and retention providers for that business, because now what we're doing is we're actually creating these great workspaces. We're having great places for people to go and getting the best out of them when they're in those environments. And we saw that before the pandemic. It was on trend. We've now got the safety aspect, and I think that's where these things will start to move. We also, before the pandemic started, there was the beginnings of people looking at how to do maintenance in a different way. So not just the traditional calendar maintenance, but bringing in intelligence into the maintenance to say, what are we actually going to do? What maintenance is it best to do today? And what's the most effective strategy for our assets? And they're the sort of things that were beginning. The industry was already being very led by the way contracts are provided and procured. And those contracts started to look for that innovation, that doing things differently. How can we be more effective with the maintenance strategies we put in place?
Thanks, Paul. And Mike, I know Vanti have obviously been at the heart of a lot of shifts in kind of workplace technology over the years. Yourselves, what trends were you seeing?
Yeah, I think lots around, well, really a combination of the two ideas, lots around productivity. And I think also helping people manage resources more effectively. So where people are moving into kind of more an agile working environment, and not everyone has a name desk and that kind of stuff, being able to book those desks in advance, managing that, being able to pull statistics out and actually look at, how frequently a desk is used. Why does no one ever sit at this desk? Oh, it's next to a noisy breakout space, or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think mostly around that really kind of conscious shift in effort from FM teams to be much more of a provider of a space that gives a good experience, rather than, as Paul mentioned, just a kind of a team that fixes things when they go wrong.
Okay. And one of the challenges, I think, for just about any organisation that COVID has presented is around long-term planning. And I just wondered, both from within the organisations that you work for, but also the FMs that you deal with, how has this affected any kind of long-term projects or existing strategies? Alan, if I just come to you first.
Well, I think it's fair to say that, and if you just try and think back over the last sort of 12, 18 months, the number of sea changes there have been about how we've thought about what the new normal might look like. And just thinking about 12 months ago, the focus that people had about coming back into office space after a hiatus of just a couple of months. And we were all thinking about coming back in October and November of last year. And a lot of planning was done around social distancing, around one-way systems, and just being able to use the office more safely. But of course, at the time, the advice from health experts was really about going to the shops. It was about going to the grocers for 20, 30 seconds, having an interaction, buying some carrots, and then going home. And really what I think people were looking at 12 months ago, well, what does it mean if somebody comes and sits down next to somebody else for 8 hours a day? And it was then, is a metre enough? Is 2 meters? Is 3 meters enough if somebody's actually going to sit down there all day? Now, those sorts of plans aren't really being made at the moment. People are thinking about, well, look, when everybody's vaccinated and they can come back and they can work relatively safely with each other, do we need a different type of space? Because the other thing that, and I think just coming back on what Paul said earlier on, well-being, I mean, people are going to come back, they want to feel safe and they want to feel secure. and they want to have a good experience when they come back to the office. So yes, it may need to change, but it has to be in some way familiar, because we don't want people to come back and just feel that they feel alienated in an environment. There's really quite a change that that people have got to go through. So I think there's probably two main pulls. One, which is people that are saying, well, the pandemic has caused us to rethink. We found that home working will work. We found that people can be productive. We found that people want to do that, but they're kind of getting to the stage where they don't want to see those four walls anymore. They want to come in, they want to collaborate, they want to see colleagues, but it's a different type of work. It's going to be 2 or 3 days at home and a couple of days in the office. So people are trying to plan for that. And by the same token, they're saying, well, is our space going to work with that? So we want people to come back, we want them to feel comfortable, but also what's it going to look like in 12 months, in 18 months? Are we going to need a completely different type of office? So I think those things are really governing people's thoughts at the moment. But the last thing I think people want is to have people to come back over the next few months and it's all changed and it's different and it's scary. And I think that's the thing that people are trying to avoid.
Okay, thanks. And Mike, anything to add to that on those long-term plans?
Yeah, I think we've always advocated for a real kind of people experience approach to everything that we do. So technology is not the important bit. What is it doing for people? And I think what we're starting to see with people's longer term outlook is, again, going back to those kind of numbers pre-pandemic, we had quite a few large corporates sat at maybe 25 or 40% occupancy in their spaces. I think people really are shifting now to a focus of the office as a destination, so it being something that is brand reinforcing, is related to talent attraction and retention, as Paul touched on, and that actually when people are looking at reducing their space, they're also looking to then spend some of those savings on up-speccing what remains, so that actually it is very conducive to good productive work, and it does have those kind of well-being facets that we've touched on as well.
Okay. And Paul, from an FSI perspective?
In terms of companies' long-term plans, what we've absolutely seen over the last year, we've had buildings opening, buildings closing, and then people might go back, and then no, you must stay at home, and then but it's okay. There's been so much confusion around everything that we're seeing the whole long-term planning being about adaptability now, and businesses being able to, even if you take a CAFM system like ours, where you're setting up your maintenance, you have all your assets, you're planning your strategies across those assets, you need the ability to immediately switch to something different as those situations arise. It's also the systems and the facilities management have had to adapt to all new things that have come in. I mean, if you go back to at the beginning of the pandemic, I think a lot of tech companies looked in their store cupboard, said, looked in their inventory, said, what tech do we have here? How can we rebadge it and call it COVID safe and push it out to the market as quickly as you can? But then I think you see some of the solutions that were immediately released aren't necessarily relevant anymore. If you take, I mean, we were seeing images of offices with walk-through temperature monitors to make sure these people, but then the vaccines come in and people are perceiving things differently. So I think the whole thing has to be about that adaptability of a business and the ability to change very quickly to react to the market.
That's point. Just staying with you and staying with that theme for a second, and I think there's probably there has been a fair degree of opportunism around COVID, but as we sort of move towards a post-COVID world or a world of just living alongside COVID, what role does technology have to play? Is it a kind of continuation of where we were at, or are there going to be changes as a result of the pandemic? What do you see?
I think we've seen a real willingness of the industry to adopt technology, especially around when we were talking about the maintenance strategies and how we're using sensor technology and how we're also using connectivity to customers and people and making everything far more accessible. And so where we may have apps for people in an office and they're able to connect with the facilities team in a different way and hopefully drive down potentially reduce visits, reduce maintenance. If you're limiting the amount of time an engineer has to visit an office, obviously at the moment that's a good thing. We've also seen businesses need to be, I mean, ourselves included, where there's a lot of touch technology around at the moment. Will touch technology ever really come back in the way it was? I mean, if you look at even McDonald's, spend an absolute fortune kitting all of their restaurants out with touchscreens. And then suddenly they're now having to clean those touchscreens after every use. There's an added cost to that. Is there different ways? The different ways that they've pushed out is it's very app-based. And the app recognises you're in the restaurant, it recognises you, and you're able to do everything off the app rather than have to use the touchscreen that they put in place.
That's a good point. And Alan, what about yourself in this technology in a post-COVID world for the workplace?
Well, I think the most difficult thing, and this is always the case when you're working with technology and using it to manage things, is there's no data. At the moment, prior to the pandemic, we were able to work with people, telling them how the workspace would be better, how it would be more efficient, how it would make people happier. All these things are predicated by having information. And at the moment, as certainly as Paul has indicated, and Mike as well, we sort of don't know, because we don't know when people are going to be back. We don't know what the regulations are going to look like. We don't know, if there's going to be other variants that may cause us problems, which means that we have no data. We don't know how people are interacting with space. We don't know how many people are going in, and we don't know what they do when they get there. So I think the most important thing, and again, also Paul said earlier, is going to be adaptability. So as soon as people start to go back into the office, as soon as they start to interact with that workspace, then technology is going to help us to know what they're doing, how they're feeling, what they're using, where they're going, how much time they're spending there. And that's going to help us to understand whether we've got it right or whether we've got it wrong. So a lot of people that are saying, well, we just want to get back to normal, we want to be how we were pre-COVID. When people start to come back in, they start measuring that and seeing how the people are interacting with what they've got, and then make decisions about how they might change that to serve their folks better. And of course, those that have actually implemented a radical change, same sort of thing. How's that going to work? When people start to come in, have they done the right thing? And then a lot of people, and again, we mentioned agile space. When agile space, when it works well, it's fantastic. But if it's imposed on people just for the sake of doing it, people hate it. And that doesn't matter how many colourful collaboration areas you stick at the front of the office. If people don't want to do that, then it's actually not going to be helpful. So without the ability to know how people work in a sort of post-COVID environment, we're just going to need to be able to measure it when they come back and then decide what's the best thing to do for the workforce.
Okay. And Mike, a couple of words there used, adaptability, agility. Are those the kind of things that you see technology helping with as FMs try and manage their workplace moving forward?
Yeah, definitely. I think, I mean, there are just some really kind of basic lessons learned out of this around things like having remote access to buildings. The number of kind of portfolios that just haven't been enabled at that basic level for secure remote access for people to dial in and change facets of the building meant that you had some buildings kind of lit up like Christmas trees, heating, cooling still running full time when there's no one there. And just this huge queue for people having to make site attendances to do those kind of basic changes. And so I think it's going to be a lot about needing to respond, as we've talked about, but also just kind of looking back over the last 12 months and going, right, okay, what didn't work? What could we put in place so that if we find ourselves in another one of these situations, it isn't the kind of scramble and mad dash that it was at the start of the pandemic, and actually people are a lot more in control of their assets. And I think that's, whilst we do focus a lot on the kind of occupier experience in a huge amount of our work, we are seeing more and more that we're now getting involved in what is the building operations side of things, and how do we allow that secure control to be given to select individuals so that they can put entire buildings into states when these kind of events occur. Okay.
Just sort of parking the COVID piece for a second. There's a phrase, Mike, that you used earlier, which I just wanted to see if you can expand on a touch, which I guess is sort of partly as a result of COVID, but partly just something that we were seeing anyway, which is this phrase of treating the workplace as a destination. I just wondered if you can go into a little bit more about, what do you mean by that, and what should FMs be considering?
Sure. So I think if anyone's looking for more information on this, Leesman and the research that they've published recently is excellent. And I think they've done a great job kind of surveying a lot of people at home, as well as the kind of normal indexing they do for office space. And I think one of the things they really talk about is the contrast between a kind of average or kind of typical office and looking at the activities that are very well achieved from home in terms of focused work, anything that involves kind of individual headspace, private telephone calls, business development or outbound calls that really should be done in an environment where you're not having lots of kind of auditory interaction. And that's very difficult to achieve in what was typically open plan office space. And so what they're looking at is this concept of a kind of outstanding office experience. And actually that really what we're looking at now is, and as we've all touched on today, kind of the more collaborative or team working environments, and also access to specialist equipment that you might not have at home. So whether that's being in a particular industry and needing to access that, or even just kind of display or presentation environments for if you're hosting clients and visitors and people like that. And I think the other thing that research has showed is that the skew and bias towards when you have a very poor working from home experience, and I think younger people are disproportionately affected by this, particularly if they're living at home with parents or whatever. That actually some people's experience of the pandemic was they were literally in a four-walled box. They would be sleeping and working in the same space, and actually that isn't great for people's mental health and well-being. And so that group tends to be very focused on kind of getting back to the office, because actually the office is a much better experience, even at a kind of typical level. But I think at the other end of that scale, you've got kind of your senior executives who are second housed in the countryside with great internet access and dedicated studies and all this kind of stuff. And so their experience is very much, it really will take quite a lot for me to shift out of this now and get back into a space where my experience is considerably worse than what I've been used to. And so I think it is a really interesting contrast, but I think it is going to require and it almost got to one stage of the pandemic where it felt like we were kind of having CEOs come out almost daily about how much office space they were going to slash from their portfolios and all this kind of stuff, almost as a bit of a competition. But I think it really is very organizationally based and also quite industry based. And just as a kind of quick anecdote, there's one legal firm that we've been working with that works in a particular industry. And what they've noticed is that industry is very heavily and aggressively going at cutting its office space. So they're actually investing in better office space for themselves that they can invite key individuals into as a kind of way of getting them proximate to them and giving them a great environment that they could be in that maybe their own organization doesn't provide themselves. And so I think you've got a real view of a lot of people like looking at this as an opportunity to improve. But also I think for large commercial portfolio owners and those kind of people, there's a lot of work to do there, from shifting from what has typically been a maintain a building and collect a rent check every quarter to actually really now starting to shift and having to provide great service for people. And that really being a differentiator now, because it isn't just the location of the building and the view out of the window anymore. It's okay, but what is this space actually doing for the organization's people?
Thanks, Mike. And Paul, presumably treating the workplace as a destination and sort of slightly less functional, as Mike says, it has been perhaps treated in some ways in the past. Does that contribute to the well-being agenda and obviously something you mentioned earlier on?
I think it does, and we're talking with our customers. They're talking about bringing people back for that collaboration piece that you just can't replicate, even on these type of calls. Getting people in a room, being able to sketch up ideas, and somehow it works as a dynamic much better with people in person. Obviously, we've all had to change over the last year and work in a very different way, and those things, the things about the collaboration has had to come out of sessions like this. But where we're seeing the customers, they're doing away with the meeting rooms and they're putting these spaces in to just bring those people together. The whole question about meeting rooms is interesting as well, because 10 years ago in the facilities industry, we saw a lot of companies having a lot of grandeur around meetings. You'd be able to book the meeting room, the room would be set up by various personnel in the layout that you required. Then there would be a projector delivered or a flip chart or whatever inventory you required. You could choose from a menu of, would it be tea, coffee, biscuits, or maybe a finger sandwich lunch, and that all of that gradually went away over the last 10 years, and we saw meeting room just be pre-set up. That's what it comes with. You've got screen on the wall, there's a whiteboard, there's a used pens, and you had no catering. There was maybe a water cooler there might be tea, coffee facilities in a nearby area, but you'd had all that service taken away and the demand was very different. And that then shaped how we were looking at the software we were producing, because you've gone from that to that. And then it was about how much efficiency can we get out of these meeting rooms? How can we get as many people in as possible, people per square meter? And then suddenly we're now into how can we use them safely and get the best out of these rooms? And which has changed everything that we're doing in terms of the software we have to provide.
Thanks, Paul. And Alan, again, just on the workplace as a destination, I'm presuming there are pitfalls and things to avoid here, if this is something you're aiming for.
Well, I think probably the number one, and it's sort of been alluded to a little bit, is what you really don't want to do is to build a temple in the centre of town where people will come and worship at the altar of your brand values. Because that's not really a very sort of human-centric thing. I guess your marketing department will probably be in all the time, but you won't get too many engineers in. So I think one of the things that I've seen is, I think it's actually within the finance sector, a couple of companies have just sort of said, well, look, we don't have so much of a demand, for example, as Paul says, for meeting rooms, say, for example, at lunchtimes. So were we, and one company in particular said, okay, if you're running a charity event, a fun run or a sponsored SIG or something like that, we'll give you free use of one of the meeting rooms, so you can come in, have a charity fundraiser, get everybody engaged with your charity project, and every pound that you raise, the company will match. And that sounds great. It's not a tremendously expensive thing for the company to do, but it absolutely engages people, with the organization, and it brings people through the door. And again, it's sort of the answers in the question. It's office as a destination. It's somewhere that we want to go to achieve something specific. And having people in, and this is another thing which was very big before the pandemic in tech, which is the idea of who do you bump into, which sounds crazy. And I think if you think back over the time we've all been working from home, one of the things I've missed is just occasionally bumping into people, whether it's in the office or whether it's at something like the facility show or a conference, whatever it might be. You bump into all sorts of people, you exchange ideas, you don't plan to do it. And in fact, in big tech, it's a whole extra science. We've done quite a bit of work in this area, because from their perspective, the worry that they have, you have a particular technology product. The one thing that worries an awful lot of CEOs is some 14-year-old going to actually eat my business with an app they wrote in their bedroom last week? So they want to make sure that the hive works, that all the minds are actually sparking off each other. And I'm sure we've all worked in offices where it gets a little bit siloed and the engineers don't talk to the marketing guys and the salespeople are out of the office. And people spend a certain amount of time working out where to put things like the coffee machine, where to put the snacks, so that they're equidistant between the people that you want to bump into each other. So that certain people in the organization don't talk to each other much, but of course, if they're getting a cup of coffee at the same time or they're getting a cup of peanuts, they're actually going to chat. And that all goes away when people are working from home. So you're going to want to get people to come back and interact in all sorts of different ways. And there are things that the organization can do, and there are things that you can provide, but you do want those interactions between people that wouldn't normally talk to each other.
Thanks, and I'm going to stay with you actually. When we talk about achieving so many different things from a workspace, sometimes we hear now that there's sort of quite a council almost of people or different professions that are involved in making these decisions, bringing in teams like HR, in particular, we're talking about aspects such as well-being. I just wonder whether this is something that you're seeing, and if so, sort of any advice on getting it right, where you've got that kind of committee coming together to set a direction.
Well, I think as one of the sort of slightly older members of the panel, having sort of done this for 30 odd years, when I started doing it, the people that ran facilities tended to be 50-year-old white men. That was pretty much across the board. And usually they became the facilities manager after being the guy that used to pay the electricity bill or whatever it might be. And this has changed, and I'm very glad to see it, which is, it's a shame, because now as a 50-year-old white man myself, it should have been good for me. But it's actually wonderful to see the diversity and the fact that you now meet people that are workspace managers that came from the HR department. And back again, years ago, the HR department, the facilities department, and the IT section, the three great engines of the back office used to fight like cats in a bag. And I think what we are now seeing is collaboration between those areas. What can be achieved? So again, it was touched on earlier on. The workspace is somewhere that people will retain staff. Tech have been doing this for years, thinking about a work environment that people are going to like, that they're going to actually want to come in to work at. So you've got that going on. That has a huge implication with human resources. Again, and the technology is the enabler. So you've actually got human resources, facilities, technology starting to work together in a much more integrated fashion than we've perhaps seen in recent years. And I think that is driving it. And again, it's really, with technology, it's not because we can do it, we should. It's really, is it appropriate? Is it going to give us what we want? Is it actually going to achieve the things that we need to achieve as an organization? And all three of those functions have a stake in that.
Thanks, Alan. And Mike, coming to you, again, just kind of thinking about that wider remit of people that might be involved in these kind of decisions. Is this something that you're seeing?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I've just sat here going, this is brilliant. Alan's basically said everything I would say. So I think, we refer to it as the Holy Trinity in terms of when we go into projects. If we can get those three groups of stakeholders engaged, particularly around defining what the experience should be, and then also looking forward into operation, because I think these have been very typically siloed kind of back office functions. And the number of projects they're involved with, where you've got a kind of a real estate team or an FM team who have gone out and bought a load of technology, and then they turn around to IT and they're like, oh, we've bought all this stuff, you're all right to look after it though, right? And that's where, if you've not got that early engagement, you haven't taken people along for the journey, it can be very difficult to do. And also particularly with IT teams who are often incredibly stretched just delivering what the organization needs, let alone looking after kind of building technology as well. That can be tricky to navigate. But I think earlier engagement, particularly and looking at the transition from whether it's building buildings or doing fit outs into operation, and making sure that gap is also closed is really, really critical. I think the teams and organizations that do that well have a far better experience when they move into those spaces.
Thanks, Mike. And Paul, just on the same theme, obviously then if you've got a sort of more varied group of people involved in those decisions, how do you ensure that you're getting all the insights? You're not just understanding the needs of the FM, the sort of the wider needs of the organization itself.
I think it's interesting when we talk about these three different groups of stakeholders, because I think the tradition's not been to share data between those individual parties. You have the HR with their particular set of data. You have FM looking at very much more on the maintenance, maybe the comfort of the facility or something like that, and then you've got the IT with the way that they tend to operate in a business. But I think what we have to understand is that facilities, and I think it might have been Alan who mentioned it earlier. We were talking about not actually being able to know what's been going on in a building because we haven't had people there. And when we look at the whole things that we talk about in the IoT, so the Internet of Things and sensor technology, I think we've missed that the most important sensor that facilities management has ever had is the actual person who works in the building. So their actual customer. for years, we've had the human as a sensor principle of people actually gathering all that facilities data and then providing it to the facilities team. They're telling them what they like, what they don't like. They're telling them that something doesn't work, or something, or an area is problematic, or the lifts are out of sync. All of that data is coming from the people. And I think it's then about taking that data and actually overlaying it with your HR factors that are more and more important, going into the well-being piece, understanding how people are, how they overcome some challenges, especially at the moment where people are working from home and they're not as visible, and actually mixing that to produce some real outcomes.
Thanks, Paul. We've got quite a few questions coming from the audience. I'm going to just go through sort of one more theme and just change tack slightly, and then we'll go into some direct questions. Just thinking about BIM, which has been obviously around for a number of years now. We've had this sort of pause in just about everything, but where does that pick up when we go back to the workplace, and how important is it likely to be? Mike, I can see you smiling. If I can come to you first.
I think it's just current pain in projects. Yeah, I think BIM's important. We're still not at a stage yet where it's very fluid in its use, and I think this is actually part of the thing that I was alluding to in the handover from kind of construction fit out into operation. Is we've been involved in projects actually within the last 18 months where you've got a construction team who are fully BIM enabled, great BIM execution plan, all that kind of stuff, and actually requires now a lot of active involvement from us in terms of making sure that all of the technology is captured within the model, as well as all the usual stuff that you'd see in there around structures and cable routes and whatever else. But when we started talking to the operational team and kind of saying, well, look, we've put all this data into the model, how are you going to keep it up to date? It became very apparent very quickly that actually that operational team was completely ill-equipped to actually maintain that information. And I think it's very, very easy. I mean, it's exactly the same with things like asset tagging, right? As soon as you've got one tag that is not in the right place or on the wrong thing, or hasn't been replaced correctly, not the whole data set, but certainly the data set becomes less useful because people's confidence in it reduces. And so I think as a kind of set of technologies that can bridge the entire kind of spectrum and life cycle of a building, yes, it's important. But I think as a kind of overall industry, we've still got a very long way to go to really make it accessible to people and to ensure that it is able to continue to kind of deliver value over the long term.
Thanks, Mike. So, Alan, do you agree? Do you still think we've got a long way for this to be really taken up by the occupiers? And if so, what do you think needs to change for that to happen?
Well, I think the risk of being boring, I completely agree with Mike. The fact of the matter is that I've said this before on the forums, that you have this wonderful technology or this tremendous capability, and in the context of building and organizations, the BIM model is used almost like the HIPS pack. It's, if you remember that from selling houses 10, 15 years ago, it's something which is created and is in a good state of repair when you build the building. And the only time you rebuild that model is when you're selling the building, 10 years later, whatever it might be. But you have all this wonderful information. I think from our point of view, and what we do, we will see a new build and we will get a BIM model and we will take the floor plans out of the BIM model and we will talk to people about, these are going to change because there's going to be new panels, there's going to be new desks, there's going to be different types of workspace, all sorts of things happening. How do we get this information back in? And at that point, we get blank stares. And whenever it is 10 years later, somebody's selling a building, then the people, the wizards come down from the mountain where the BIM model is kept, and they ask us to provide them with the up-to-date floor plans and all these things. And they go back up the mountain, do what they do, and the BIM model is updated. So absolutely interfaces with day-to-day. If it can interface with the day-to-day, with what people actually do, whether that's with the wiring, whether that's with the ventilation, whether that's with the fit out, whether that's with the furniture, if that information flows easily in both directions, and I think that's the key to making it useful for everybody all the time.
Okay, and Paul, BIM, is that a sort of an important subject matter from what you're seeing, or a bit of a distraction?
Yeah, so it's interesting for us as FSI. We've seen two phases of BIM. We're seeing BIM being used as a principle where organisations already have their buildings. They're already built. They're already occupied. And the nature of facilities is you tend to go in once that's happened. So the BIM project would have been done way before the design and build. So we're into the situation where an organisation has a building, and we've been involved in some large projects where they're taking the principles of BIM, so the whole classification piece and identification of the assets, and actually applying that rather than being too concerned about the actual 3D model and the whole imagery piece. And they're actually running that principle to guarantee the quality of their assets, to make sure that they're able to carry out the maintenance most effectively, and actually knowing the assets they've got, knowing that they're classified correctly, enables them to do benchmarking and all that type of thing. And that's what you get of the principles of BIM. For the other hand, we also get involved very early, much earlier in a new build than we ever would previously. Generally, we tend to, as FSI, we tend to go in with the facilities company once the building's been built, and then it's a question of let's work out what's been put in here. And you do the surveys and the asset collections and all that type of exercise. But now we're providing the service so that organisations are able to take the various different stages of the BIM design, bring that into our CAFM product, so the facilities people can understand the suitability of that BIM data for facilities management. And the reason we did that is way back when we started working with BIM, everything that was being brought into our system to build a concept system was structural data, and it was absolutely no use for facilities management. But now we're able to provide that service of taking the iterations of the BIM model as the project progresses. Facilities can engage with the design team and the construction phase to actually have their input, because they're able to actually see how that data would work in a facilities management software package.
Thanks, Paul. We've had a few questions coming from the audience. If you've got any further questions as we go through these, then do keep on submitting. One question that's come in around part of the early discussion, someone mentioned productivity, and the question is employee monitoring software ever likely to be part of the FM remit? I'm not sure how welcome FMs would be if that is going to be part of their role. Alan, I'm not sure what your view is on this.
Well, I think going back to what I said, any use of technology, and if you look at, for example, the CIPD surveys on this, people are very worried about technology that monitors them. And I think the key for facilities management is to monitor premises fine, but if you overstep the line and make people think that you're spying on them, then you will have a problem. It's really a question of making sure. To give you actually an example of that, this sounds very intrusive, but it sort of speaks to some of the other concepts which we spoke to earlier on. We worked with a company that were advising a large engineering firm that was seeing a very high turnover of staff. And they did all the things asking about, were they happy with the employment package? Were they happy with the money? Were they happy with the premises? And not getting the answers they need. And what they did is they actually engaged somebody to analyze all the communication sent out of the organization, emails, text. They ran it through exactly the same sort of engine that you'd run through tweets on Twitter or posts on Facebook to see which things are trending. And they came up with some remarkable results. And they actually found out that a lot of engineers weren't happy with the firm. And again, it's a chain of things. We don't like this, we don't like that. Oh, we're leaving when the chain gets too long. And they were unhappy with the mobile phone that the company was giving them. And they'd actually, the marketing department had sort of said, well, look, we'll give them all, the iPhones are what we use. And HR had said, iPhones are what we use. But they were engineering led, and they didn't particularly like Apple in the engineering section. So they actually they didn't like the fact that the mobile phone was pre-decided for them. They wanted a choice. And it wasn't something that ever came up in an exit interview, and it wasn't something that came up in just workspace polling, but it was something that the company could easily fix. Now, on the one hand, isn't that wonderful to get that insight to actually make everybody happier? But in order to do it, the reason they didn't continue this ongoing is that most of the people in the company didn't like the idea that a machine was reading their emails and actually coming to decisions from it. So it provides a very interesting result, but it also is opens up the debate and says that, yeah, what if people don't like it? So the fact of the matter is, if it provides insight and it provides gives you information about how the workspace is being used, it's useful, but it has to be open. People have to be engaged with it. It can't suddenly appear, and it can't appear as a fait accompli. So I think, and that from that respect, yes, it does become very much part of facilities, but there is a line, and you need to know that you need to stay the right side of it.
Thanks, Alan. Mike, another question's come in, so it's like I'm going to pop to you. In fact, there's two questions that I think are kind of related. One of which uses a phrase I've not heard before. It's if you were the owner of an in brackets dumb building, what would be the 3 smart solutions that you'd invest in first? And a related question, I think, is just generally, how do you see the future of smart technology adapting over the next few years? Where do we go from here?
Okay, so yeah, dumb, smart, and intelligent is broadly how we deconstruct things. For a bit of a plug, if you go onto our website into the news section, look at thought leadership, there is a spectrum that outlines the definitions of each. Yeah, so in terms of if you've got a dumb building, what we always talk about is there's lots of opportunities, and I think the kind of current criticism of smart or intelligent, whichever you prefer to use, or connected from some years gone by, it is really that this could only be done in kind of shiny glass towers that are coming out of the ground now. Well, yes and no. I think related to what we were saying earlier about enabling for productivity, and if you enable for productivity, you then get the space saving, you get the energy saving, and so you get that kind of return on investment. It's the same deal when you're looking at building enablement. So it's going to be very expensive if you are sat in a finished building on day one and going, let's make this a smart building, because you will need to open up cable routes, you will need to install a bunch of new stuff, and that can be quite disruptive. There are ways, and Paul's touched on some of this in terms of things that more sit in the kind of IoT camp, where you can retrofit wireless technologies a lot more easily into existing spaces. So you don't need to open up cable routes and all of that kind of stuff. But the downside of that is you're then maintaining batteries, and you've got FM people running around with huge cardboard boxes full of batteries to swap out every couple of years, and also those sensors can be easily moved or kicked off or whatever. So I think the thing that we generally advise, particularly if you're in anything that's probably above kind of 20,000 square feet, is really you start looking for an opportunity whereby you have some kind of refurbishment coming up. That really is your kind of sweet spot for going, okay, well, rather than just doing a refurb and putting some paint about the place, okay, well, we are going to open up some cable routes, then we're going to put them back, and then we're going to finish it as we intended. So the incremental cost and the impact isn't one of kind of wholesale revolution, and you're also achieving the outcomes that you're looking for. In terms of the crystal ball question, yeah, I think in terms of looking further down the spectrum, we are looking towards a world that is kind of ultimately self-optimizing. But I think we are looking really at needing a very generalized artificial intelligence that would be able to understand a lot of things like sentiment and what it means when people have meetings and what they're doing in meetings, to really be able to start optimizing around what's going on. So working back from that, I think what we're really looking at is something much more around kind of machine learning and things that are really rules-based. So we can kind of put these things in place that are really if this then that. So if this thing happens as an event, then we can respond to it in this way and do these other things. But really, I think it comes back to what we've all said, which is technology for the sake of technology is not useful to anyone. And so the words that we always use with our clients is begin with the end in mind. So, if you ask 100 people what smart building is, you broadly get 100 different answers. And so really it's about coming together within the organization to understand what does it mean for us? What are the key metrics that we want to understand? What are the things that we want to enable for our people? Could we help them, just by providing better hybrid meeting facilities so that we know we're going to have a bunch of people in the office, there will inevitably be a bunch of people at home. How do we better connect them? Are there collaborative technologies that we could better use to enhance the experience for both sides? But it is very much about putting people at the centre of this. And it is also about, to Alan's point, giving people control of their data and understanding what data is being used when, and also following a opt-in rather than an opt-out policy, because people get very upset when they find out that you've been collecting all this stuff and they needed to tell you that you didn't want to, and particularly important in terms of personally identifiable information and GDPR. So looking at that opt-in as an opportunity to say to people, well, if you share your location, you can find the location of other people. Like, that is a sensible trade-off, but there will inevitably be people that do not want to be found during their workday, and so do not want to share where they're at. And that should be a really personal decision. And so I think where people will win out in this is where they're creating very human, very people-based experiences that are ultimately facilitated by good, reliable technology, and not getting lost in, bells, whistles, features, latest trends. It is, how do you create really consistent experiences but deliver them really well, so people know that they can rely on them?
Thanks, Mike. And Paul, just we talked a bit about sort of changing the actual workspace itself, but it's just in terms of people's property footprints. Can you see a shift to smaller hubs in surrounding areas rather than in the main cities over the next few years as a result of COVID?
I think it's something that we've definitely had our customers talk to us about, because they're, especially with the cost of renting, say, a large facility inside London, when suddenly everyone's realised that maybe that's not so necessary. But like we said earlier, it's very important to be able to bring people together to have that collaboration, and the opportunity of regional bases. I think it's quite strange how lots of offices have already gone down the route of if you imagine a workplace, traditionally you'd have rows and rows of desks or cubicles, and then suddenly that started to change, and people started to put in this. I think it was probably the Google idea of bean bags and sofas and all these trendy workspaces, but they still had those rows and rows of desks for people to go back to. When they actually had finished that piece of collaboration in the comfy zone, or whatever they called it, with the coffee machine or the beer tap, or like we see at some of the multi-shared facilities. But what they've realised now is you don't necessarily have to have those rows and rows of desks in the office. People can do that at home. They can go back to their desk at home and do their tasks. They don't necessarily have to be in that traditional way of working. So the smaller hub principle, with that space, the right space for people to be able to get together and do things, I think is going to be incredibly important moving forward.
Thanks, Paul. And final question, and Alan, you've given us a bit of your background and your experience. So you're naturally the person to come to for a question around millennials. Questions come in. Has consideration been given that millennials prefer not to work in an office as tech meets their mobile or remote preferences? What do you think?
Well, I think what you have to bear in mind is that millennials are actually getting quite middle-aged now. You're talking about people that came of age around about the year 2000 and hence the term. So the people that I think are really interesting, and that they're the people that lost a lot of work when the pandemic started and are probably going to drive the economic recovery, is the generation beyond the millennials. It's Generation Z. So I think if our thinking is around millennials, then again, they're now not so much. These are people that are now going into the CEO suite. Millennials are now getting into their 30s and 40s, and they're running companies. So effectively, these are people that are now going to be our bosses, rather than people that we're trying to hire and design workspace around. So workspace is really around sort of Generation Z, the people that are actually sort of born in the 90s, coming up to the noughties, and these are the ones that are coming into the workplace. And these are the people that I think we need to, bear in mind. What do they want? How do they work? And again, it's sort of increasingly we are seeing, and it just sort of coming back to the last point, less and less people don't want to live in the center of cities anymore. We've got people that work for us that are in that generation And frequently we've been on Zoom calls, and they've somebody living in central London with a partner who's also doing a Zoom call joins one of our tech meetings and says, I'm calling you from by the shoe rack today because it's the only piece of space I've got. And those people are now thinking about when they can afford property, they're not looking to move into the center of town as perhaps they were a generation ago. They're now actually thinking about, should we move outside of town? And that's probably going to drive businesses as well. So rather than having a large office inside central London, as you say, hubs outside, which are actually more suited to people that are getting onto the property market, and the sorts of properties that they'll buy residential will have space to work, which, for example, flats in big cities at the moment don't when you start on a property market and buy your first property. So I think the key things within that generation is available residential space with workspace in, and the smart companies are going to be the people that actually make it easy for them to get to work, rather than actually fight with our good friends at Southern Rail to get into London.
Thanks for that, Alan. And I think that's all we've got time for in terms of questions today. I just want to say thanks to our speakers, Paul, Mike, and Alan, for your insight and expertise. I think that's made for a really rich discussion. There's a lot of different areas that we've covered in that discussion. And anyone who wants to watch back or share that within the next 24 to 48 hours, today's discussion will be available to watch on demand on the Facility Show Connect platform. While you're using the platform, for those of you who'd like to know more about any of the suppliers that are engaged, including FSI, with Facility Show Connect, please do click on the Exhibitor tab at the top of your screens, visit their booths. You can have a look through more information and details about products and services, and actually arrange virtual meetings directly through the platform itself. Thanks also to everyone in the audience for your questions and your participation and your attention. In addition to our focus on FM this week, we've also got content running right the way throughout June. We have on-demand content on security already. And next week, our focus will turn to health and safety, then fire safety, and some more security content running towards the end of the month. So there's plenty there for everybody. But that's all from this session. Thanks to everyone for being involved, for your time, and have a great day.